Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the SAS meetup for September 2020. I'm Rick Robenheimer. I'm president of the South African Secular Society, and I'll be your Zoom master today. The presentation will be done by John Osterwick, and John has given me what he calls a short bio to give you beforehand by way of introduction. Dr. John Osterwick holds a higher diploma in education, physical science and mathematics from Wits, as well as a BA in psychology, an honours degree, a master's from Wits and a PhD from UCT, although he started it at Edinburgh. His PhD deals with the existence of God from the perspective of Bayesian statistics. He has completed a number of other short courses, including Prince 2 and Linux System Administration. His research areas cover matters relating to the mind and psychology, theory of education, and religion. He has 7 peer-reviewed journal articles. He has written a number of books which are available on Amazon.com, and he reviews articles for 4 academic journals, including 3 local and 1 international journal. He has also exhibited artworks. His employment history includes being a staff member at Wits in computer science and working for various South African government departments and NGOs, including the Department of Basic Education, where he was in the Director General's Business Process Unit. He also project managed the National IT Rollout Plan, Operation Pakisa. He is currently a government director and is also a partner in an IT company. Today, John is going to present to us a presentation entitled, "Does the Theory of Evolution Threaten Religion?" And after the presentation, there will be time for questions from the audience. John, over to you.
Thanks, Rick. First of all, can everyone hear me?
Loud and clear.
Good, great. All right, let me do the share screen thing. Rick, I'll ask you to manage the guests if they come in.
Yes, as will Judith, now, as we notice.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try to put it onto full screen mode. I don't know if it's going to work, but let's just see.
You should be able to share either a screen or a window, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Can you see the presentation, everyone?
Yeah.
All right. So this presentation's got quite a lot of slides. I'm going to go through it quite fast. The part that I'll dwell on will be the more technical parts, because I think this particular audience primarily consists of the converted, so to speak. So I don't want to spend too much time preaching to the choir. Disclaimer, very important disclaimer. The views presented in this talk do not represent the views of any organization whatsoever. That's just so that my employers don't be upset with me for saying things they don't like. So the presentation is divided into 2 parts. What is creationism, what's evolution, and what are the problems? And then the second part is evolution a threat to belief? And that's subdivided into specific headings. So creationism generally, religion generally, Christianity in particular, and whether evolution could in fact help religion. So my argument will be that it can. So what is creationism? So I understand or believe there to be 3 varieties of creationism. Scriptural literalism, which I equate to young earth creationism, because if you read the scriptures, you'll see that they necessitate from their timelines that young earth creationism is true. The second version of creationism is deism, and the third version, the modern version, is intelligent design. So obviously these sort of pictures where you've got these spirals get creationists all excited, and they say, well, clearly this is evidence of design. And my answer, well, any scientific answer would be no, this is clearly not evidence of design. It's just Fibonacci sequence. It's nothing special. So it's a mathematical output of just how nature unfolds. All right, so what is scriptural literalism or young earth creationism? So this is the position that God exists. God created the world as we see it with its current creatures recently, in other words, 600 years ago or thereabouts, in 6 literal days. Sometimes you'll have guys who will avoid that point and they'll hum and haw and maybe say, no, it wasn't literally 6 days. But then they're sort of gliding towards the deist or intelligent design position. So young earth creationists is your 6,000 year mark. God intervenes in the world regularly. Evolution does not take place. In other words, special creation, everything was created as is. And then the general support for this is the claim that the Bible's true, and it's the word of God, it's the divine word of God, and therefore it's infallible. And so what's in the Bible is a literal record of how everything appeared. So I like this diagram on the side, which explains the YEC position. The Bible is true because the Bible says the Bible is true. It just goes in a circle. All right, some other examples of YEC. So fossils, various explanations from YEC people. One is that it's a satanic hoax. So the devil put the fossils there to test our faith. Scientific hoax, like Piltdown Man, we know that was a hoax. Dinosaurs and humans coexisted. That's another story. Possibly there are other explanations. I'll show you a humorous example on the next slide. The flood happened, according to YEC. Hence, there are no more dinosaurs. So the flood wiped out the dinosaurs. That's usually the story. The ark has been found on Mount Ararat, and therefore Genesis is true. And voila, there's a photograph of the ark on Mount Ararat. Anyone who has half a brain can see that's just a geological fossil, geological structure of some kind. But apparently YECs think this is a boat, because you know boats get fossilized in 6,000 years, right? No, they don't. So here's a cute picture from an American YEC textbook used in schools in the States, which shows why the dinosaurs died out. Got nothing to do with asteroids and iridium and all those sciencey things. It's just they fell into the holes they dug looking for food. I don't know if this is meant to be taken seriously, but I can't really take it seriously. So what is deism and what is intelligent design? So intelligent design and deism are quite similar. Deism is the old sort of 1700s term. Intelligent design is the American term. So deism is the position that God intervenes. So in other words, you can give scientific explanations like Big Bangs or evolution or whatever, but God directs these things. So God, or the intelligent designer, which I'm going to call Ed for short, set up the laws of the universe, created the world using natural forces, and the metaphorical 6 days could be 6,000 days, could be 6 million years, it doesn't matter. God, or the intelligent designer, then sat back and watched the world take shape. Speciation does take place, but it's directed by God, or it's under his laws, his or her laws. And God and intelligent designers differ really on the extent to which God intervenes subsequently. So the intelligent designer, our ID position is that the intelligent designer guides evolution, and the deist position is that God doesn't intervene. He just set it up once and it ran from there. So deist intelligent design is basically very similar sort of position, except to the extent of intervention. So your ID theorist thinks that God continuously intervenes. So there's some respected historical adherents of this. So David Hume, the most famous of the analytic tradition of philosophers, very smart guy, wrote his book when he was 21. He was an adherent of deism, but it's also possible that he just said that so that he wouldn't get charged with blasphemy. Modern ID proponent, the most famous is Michael Behe, American. And then the question comes for, well, where is the evidence for ID rather than, say, just straightforward laws of universe. And that comes as follows. You've got a number of cases in biology where we see things that are really remarkable that look too complex prima facie to be evolutionary. So there we see an electron micrograph of a bacterium with a little tail. It's called the bacterial flagellum. There's a schematic diagram of how it works, where it's effectively an electric motor. And the ID position on this is way too complex to have evolved. It must have been created by an intelligent designer. Other examples they give are the eye. So the human eye is quite fancy. Doesn't look like something that could have evolved. Another example is the blood cascade, the blood clotting cascade. So how does blood clot? So if you see the chemical reaction involved in blood clotting, it involves many steps. And the chances of those things all evolving in one shot are very low. And the other examples, like if you think about an arch. So the classical example of an arch, you've got a keystone in the middle, you pull the keystone out, the whole thing falls down. So an arch would never form spontaneously like that. It had to be intelligently designed. Another example is a mousetrap. If you pull out one of the components, it's no longer a mousetrap, it can't work as a mousetrap. Another example is the watch in the desert. So you're walking in a desert, you find a watch. This is Paley's example, the geologist. If you find a watch in a desert, you can say, well, this is clearly intelligently designed. There's no ways this thing appeared spontaneously. It's too complex. So these are all the familiar arguments that we've heard for intelligent design. We might want to call this intelligent design a god, but some intelligent designers would say it's aliens. For example, von Daniken, the interesting Swiss guy who claimed that we were created by aliens. So the fundamental argument of the ID theorist is that there isn't a scientific answer for abiogenesis. In other words, how life appeared out of nothing, or the primeval soup. However, there are problems with both forms of creationism. So let's go through those quickly. So YEC, literal creationism. Problem with that is the vast number of contradictions in scripture which suggest that scripture cannot be true. So the diagram at the bottom, the red cloud at the bottom, is not missiles hitting each other and flying from different countries to blow each other up. That is contradictions in the Bible. So where one verse contradicts another directly. So I've listed a few examples there where no man has seen the face of God and a man has seen the face of God, etc. Genesis also contradicts well-established scientific evidence. So for example, if you read Genesis 1:3 and 1:14, you'll see that the plants and the light are created before the sun, which makes absolutely no sense. Furthermore, if the world is only 6,000 years old, why do we not find partially fossilized Romans or Egyptians? Because they've been around for 2,000 and sort of 5,000-ish respectively. So we would expect partially fossilized Egyptians, which we don't find. So therefore fossilization couldn't take place in such a short time span, so therefore anything fossilized is much older than 6,000. On the issue of the flood, if we look for the so-called evidence of a global flood that the early geologists purported, it was actually just evidence of glacial movement. And then we look at something like Epic of Gilgamesh from the Middle East, where that pretty much describes the Noah's Ark flood scenario. That was very obviously borrowed into the Hebrew mythology. Furthermore, there's conservation of matter problems. So if we did have a global flood that covered the entire planet, where did the water go? Conservation of matter energy says we couldn't have had it destroyed, so it must have gone somewhere. Maybe it froze into the ice caps, but even if we do defrost all the ice caps, it still won't cover the entire planet. So lastly, there's the arc anomaly on Mount Ararat, which is very clearly just a geological thing. There's a range of possible explanations for it, such as glacial rock movement, pyroclastic flow, etc., etc. Dating methods used by scientists. So one of the criticisms of science is that the dating method's unreliable. I've yet to see an ID theorist actually show that this is true. The algorithm or formula for doing carbon dating and uranium dating is quite straightforward. It's just a quotient, which is the known decay rate of the elements in the rock. We divide the quantity found in the rock versus the known quantity that should exist over time given the half-life. So you can work out in a fairly simple high school level formula how old a rock is by the quantity of isotopes present. And this applies to uranium dating, carbon dating, all of them. The only thing is that with carbon dating, it's known by scientists to be unreliable for the simple reason that carbon-14 turns to carbon-12 within a roughly 60,000 year time frame. So anything older than 60,000 years simply can't be carbon dated because absolutely everything would have lost the carbon-14 proportion by that time. So the half-life of carbon is too short to allow us to carbon date longer. So that whole argument that carbon dating is inaccurate is just really a red herring. As for cases where they carbon date something new and find that it's ancient, again, that just depends on what happens. So if for example, you find an organism that carbon dates at 1,000 years old, but it's actually only 1 year old, that would suggest that the organism in question just consumed something that had a high carbon-14 ratio in it for whatever reason. It doesn't prove anything about the actual age of the organism. So the whole argument about the accuracy of scientific dating is really a red herring. So that's young Earth creationism. Here's a quick refutation of intelligent design. Obviously, it's a humorous refutation. So intelligent design pretends to be scientific over here, then a miracle occurs and it continues being scientific over here. And the scientific community's reaction to ID is always, I think you should be more specific. How this miracle occurs, it's not really like Harry Potter where you just go Wingardium Leviosa and suddenly there's a bacterial flagellum. So the problems with deism and ID as follows. Deism is a cosmological model. It's irrelevant to evolution. So God intervenes in the Big Bang, but not really afterwards. So we don't need to resort to deism. Let's not confuse abiogenesis and evolution. Furthermore, putative examples of intelligent design can be successfully explained by reference to prior parts with different functions or scaffolding. So for example, if you want an arch to stand up, you just need to scaffold it. A mousetrap, if you remove part of it, it's still a bulldog clip. You remove the base, it's still a spring, so it's still useful. Half an eye is still useful for telling light and dark apart, or object proximity, even if it can't resolve a clear image. Just as partial hearing is better than full deafness. More primitive cascade mechanisms in blood exist in more primitive species, so that one's refuted. Bacterial flagella may have evolved from a viral injector or secretor or a support mechanism, so again, it could still be useful even if it wasn't motile. So this is what we call the recruitment thing in biology, where a part that was used previously for a different function gets recruited to perform a new function. So this leaves us with evolution being most likely correct. Another thing that theists confuse is the misconceptions. So they have an issue around misunderstanding what evolution is about. So there's a bunch of stereotyped objections to evolution, which led to it being satirized, as we can see this nice picture of Darwin. So the first misconception is the just a theory misconception. Then there's the linear evolution misconception. There's the why are there still monkeys just conception. There's the I've never seen it happen misconception, and so on. So I'll address these misconceptions briefly here. So the just a theory misconception, well, the theories include gravity, relativity, and quantum mechanics. So we don't tend to disregard those. So what a theory means in science is not just a guess, like in theory the Springboks will win. It means something more like a model with a formula that predicts. So the way scientific progress works is you make a hypothesis based on your evidence. If it predicts future evidence, it's then accepted as the standard theory. This is a modesty behavior. In other words, we're calling it a theory just because we don't want to say it's a fact. The reason we don't want to say it's a fact is out of modesty, meaning that any future contradictory evidence could refute the theory. So some examples of theories that have been discarded: Bohr's atom, the Greek elements, phlogiston, the ether. So those of you not familiar with these, Bohr's atom is the one that looks like a little series of planets. That's been replaced with quantum mechanics. The Greek elements, earth, air, fire, water, that's been discarded. Phlogiston being a kind of a substance that causes combustion, and the ether being an all-pervasive sort of force field. All of these have been since refuted or disregarded because they don't serve useful theoretical purpose. So if something is just a theory, well, there you go. Gravity is just a theory, go on. So another misconception, we're not a direct sequence of steps. So we've all seen this diagram with the monkey, chimp, a taller monkey standing up, a monkey with a spear, a monkey with a stick, and then a human. That is not how evolution happens. Our ancestry is a tree with many dead branches. Your ancestors outnumber you. So you've got 8 great-grandparents, 4 grandparents, 2 parents, meaning you'll have 16 great-great-grandparents, 32 great-great-grandparents, and so on. So you're just a leaf on a very big tree. So our actual ancestry looks something more like that, with lots of dead branches. So if you look at this, you can see Erectus died out, Boise died out, Rudolfensis died out, and so on. So it's only Neanderthalensis and Sapiens, which we think were recent. There is also, as we know from about 2008, Homo florensis from Indonesia, where they think they found a survivor of Erectus or habilis, I can't remember which one. So on the issue of the monkey still exist, there's a common misconception that one day a fish gave birth to a frog, or a monkey gave birth to a human, and that's not what evolution says. Creationists complain monkeys still exist, and the answer is not about, well, monkeys still exist. It's not about fishes giving birth to frogs. It's really about success in a niche based on features. So monkeys are somewhere further down the same tree of primata, they're just not in the same branch. So if we go back to this diagram here, roughly 6 million years ago at the bottom here, that's where the chimps and other apes split off from the human lineage. So another objection is I've never seen it happen. Well, that's clearly false. So extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, the flu. Why do we get a new flu shot every year? Because the flu virus is evolving. Why do we have extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis? Because it's evolved to be able to avoid antibiotics. Dog breeding is deliberate evolution controlled by humans. It's speciation. Mud skippers, leaping blennies, lungfish, and handfish. Those are 4 examples of fish which show terrestrial features. So either front limbs that can be used for propulsion, or the ability to breathe air by going to the surface. So there's 2 photographs at the bottom of 2 species of mud skipper, where the fish breathes underwater and then climbs out onto land. It takes millions of years for a significant mutation to happen spontaneously in a particular birth, and for that evolution to, speciation to occur as a result of that. Another example, very nice example, the Watson from South America, very similar to the Archaeopteryx shown in the bottom corner. The baby, when it's born, has got claws on its, what would be its wrist. So if you look at the baby Watson on the corner there, it's got tiny claws that it uses to climb, just like the Archaeopteryx has on its wing. And this is a evolutionary atavism, clearly showing the evolution of birds from reptiles, or what are they called? Dromaeosaurs, the Dromidae, the running dinosaurs, velociraptors, those kind of things. So we have a modern day clear series of examples of evolution happening right before our eyes. We just don't see it happen fast enough to believe it. Well, at least not everyone. So what is evolution then? So the actual process, as we know, it's a simple mutation occurs, it's successful when the organism breeds, or vice versa. It's a bad mutation, it's not successful, the organism dies before it can breed. Some mutations have no major effect on breeding success and they perpetuate. So alopecia, for example, which I have the misfortune of suffering from, it's not been sufficiently bad a mutation for me to not breed, and therefore my lineage continues. So it becomes randomly part of the population. Whereas if it's something that causes the creature to not breed or die out, you then find the mutation appears randomly, but it dies out quickly. So polar bears are white because if they were black, they'd be visible to their prey in the snow, hence they would die out. Similarly with white lions and tan lions, white lions are the anomaly. They disappear and die out shortly after appearing because they can't catch their prey. So it's got nothing to do with a species changing into another, it's about features accumulating. So the easiest way I find this to explain this to people who are evolution skeptics, as I said, it's really just about accepting the following premise, that if a being gives birth to a baby and the baby has a feature which helps it survive, the baby will probably live long enough to have babies. And you say, okay, do you accept that? Yes, you accept that. Well, you've accepted evolution, you've accepted the whole theory. Why? Because that's really what it requires to be true. So it's a probabilistic argument. Another feature that's important, geographical isolation. So if you geographically isolate populations, they start to develop separate species from a certain degree of inbreeding, and then you get unique features and greater speciation. So we see this with the famous Darwin's finches cases. So where's some evidence? There we go. Fossil of a dinosaur. The plate tectonics show we've got similar animals on those boundaries of plate tectonics. You've got cases of hands, so morphology, where all vertebrates have 5 digits, 4 limbs, 7 cervical vertebrae, regardless of neck length. So even a giraffe has the same number of cervical vertebrae as us. Embryology, so your embryos all look the same when they start out. All embryos have notochords and gill slits, even human beings. So yes, we have gills before we turn into sort of more humanoid-shaped embryos. In fact, there's a very interesting experiment a few years ago where they tweaked a bit of DNA in a chicken embryo, and it developed features of a lizard-like head, including signs of growing teeth and things like that. So further evidence, atavisms and vestigial features, so back limbs in snakes and whales. So there's a picture of a whale with his back legs. Ostrich, penguins, kiwi wings. So ostriches, penguins, and kiwis don't really need to fly, but they have wings. The coccyx in the human being, which is of course a tail. Unintelligent designs are proof that ID is false. So why would God design us with an air and food passage joined? A lot of animals don't have that feature, so they don't suffocate or choke. We suffocate and choke easily because we've got a bad design. DNA is another form of evidence. So we're 98 to 99% the same as the chimp. And the percentage declines the more dissimilar the creature. So I think a mouse, if I remember right, was 72% the same as a human. So DNA shows the same family relations as the morphological studies do, reconfirming them. And then obviously there's uranium dating methods. So there's your whale evolutions showing the feet disappearing. There's a nice example of primate evolution happening right before our eyes. There's a chimp walking on his back legs, and there's a chimp at the top using a spear to catch another primate and eat it. So we tend to think of cavemen as walking on their back feet and carrying a spear. Well, there you go, there's a chimp. We're separated from this guy by 6 million years, and he's doing quite a lot of human stuff there. That was New Scientists, March 2007. So there's a summary in one chart of the evidence for evolution. That certainly for me is more impressive than "and then God said." So the big question, and I think the reason religious people resist evolution, is they think it's a big threat to their religion. And the purpose of this presentation, which is what I'm getting to, is that I would tend to argue that evolution is not in fact a big threat to religion. It's a very specific threat. It represents a very specific threat, and it's not a total threat. And I think a lot of atheists think that evolution is a big threat to religion. It's not, and I can demonstrate this, and I will demonstrate this. So the first question is, does evolution threaten creationism? Well, the answer is it depends on which creationism. So if you think of deism, which confines itself to cosmology, the anthropic principle, and things like that, so God just started the universe, evolution doesn't threaten that. Why? Because evolution takes place after abiogenesis. So if, for example, you grant that God did the abiogenesis thing and that he made the planets, that's okay. You can still grant that, and evolution doesn't threaten that. So as long as we lack 100% explanations for abiogenesis, consciousness, and a few things like that, you can fill that gap with God, which is your God of the gaps argument. And evolution has nothing to say on those things, so it really cannot refute God on those points. Intelligent design is threatened because it insists on ongoing intelligent intervention in speciation like guided evolution. So that is threatened by evolution, because the theory of evolution suggests that evolution happens without guidance. So for me, what makes the intelligent design theory clearly nonsense is the existence of atavisms. So if evolution was intelligently managed by God, we wouldn't get atavisms. Evolution clearly threatens young Earth creationism because of the timescales and the disagreements between timescales. But the main threat to theism is the increasing number of gaps, the decreasing number of gaps we need to fill with God. So if we look at, for example, our state of knowledge in the medieval period, we will see that most gaps that existed in the medieval period were that people thought that God needed to fill. So what is disease, what is psychological disorder, etc. Those have been explained by science, so we're now just left with the Big Bang and consciousness, I think, as the main mysteries left in science. So we can guess or induce, as we say in philosophy, that all phenomena ultimately will be explained without God. So it looks like the God of the gaps has got less and less to do. Does evolution threaten religion? So let's look more specifically at this. So this is Bayes' theorem at the top of the screen there. It looks scary, but it's not really. It's just a multiplication over a divisor. And we've got, so it reads as follows. The probability of the hypothesis, given the evidence, is equal to the probability of the evidence, given the hypothesis, multiplied by the probability of the hypothesis prima facie, divided by the probability of the evidence prima facie. So if we put evolution and theism in there, it goes the probability of theism given the evidence of evolution is equal to the probability of evolution being true given theism times the probability of theism being true divided by the probability of evolution being true without theism. So if you actually put numbers into these, some reasonable numbers, you'll find that it gives a low value for theism, but it doesn't refute deism. So for example, if you think that of all the overwhelming amounts of evidence for evolution, it makes the PE element at the bottom quite strong, and the pH element at the top, even if you weight it at 50-50, the divisor at the bottom makes it strong enough to reduce that effect and give you a low resultant pH given E. So I'll show you an example of this kind of calculation shortly. So if we put aside the creationism thing, we can say that religion offers many things like moral codes, comfort under stress or loss, certain wisdoms. I mean, if we put aside Christianity, which has a bunch of weird moral codes, there are some religions that have reasonable moral codes. And some of those are not offered by science. Science doesn't generally say much about morality, except as a sort of biological explanation of, say, tribal or herd cohesiveness. And none of those advantages are in fact threatened by the theory of evolution and are in fact supported by it. For example, chimps and others show moral behaviors. such as fairness, sharing, mutual support. So the question that might come up for an atheist then is if Genesis is false because of evolution, surely the rest is false? And the answer is not necessarily. So think of a historical novel. Say you've got a novel in which features JFK and he says certain things in the novel. You don't know he said those things. Those things might be false, but the rest of the novel might still be true. So what we could say is that evolution only lowers the probability of the truth of the Bible. So if we weight Genesis by numbers of pages, say at about 1.5% of the Bible, it still gives the Bible a 98% possibility of being accurate. I mean, obviously there are other problems with it, but let's not go into those. So when people say they feel threatened by evolution, you can actually say that no. If you look at the sheer weighting of the Bible by books, evolution at most threatens about 1.5% of that book. So really, it's not that big of a threat. What is a more substantial threat that evolution brings to the whole religious literalism position is that if you admit that there is a flaw in the Bible and you admit that the Bible contains a flaw, namely Genesis is false, then what happens is you're admitting in effect that the Bible is not the divinely inspired word of God. It becomes a imperfect human product, or at least 1.5% of the Bible is imperfect. That's what you're guaranteeing. So then you can't go for young earth creationism anymore, but you can still be a deist. So in my view, only young earth creationism and its modern child, intelligent design, are threatened by evolution. It's not religion itself, it's just those two versions of creationism that are threatened. What really threatens religion is the position known as materialism. Materialism is the position that there's no such thing as a spiritual. But materialism is not the same thing as the theory of evolution, and you can believe in materialism without believing in evolution, and you can believe in evolution without believing in materialism. They don't necessarily entail each other logically. So for example, if you're not a materialist, in other words, you think there might be such a thing as the spiritual, then it's not incoherent, or it is coherent, to believe that evolution is true and God exists. Because if you believe in the spiritual, you can believe in God. And if you're not committed to the materialist position that everything is physical, then you can still believe in religion, even though evolution might disprove Genesis. So on the side here, I've got a diagram showing fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. So this is where we can see what's happening in somebody's brain based on their mental states. And for me, this is by far a much bigger threat to religion than evolution is, but I'll leave that discussion for the end. The last part of this discussion of whether evolution threatens religion, what I'd like to talk to about is the very specific case of Christianity and what threat evolution poses for Christianity rather than religion broadly. So according to Christianity, we know the story. Eve was tempted, there was the fall of man, and we are born in sin. So according to Christianity, due to the fall, we're born in sin and we need redemption through the person of Jesus Christ, who was sacrificed to mitigate our sin in the Garden of Eden. Now, if Genesis is false, it means the fall of man didn't occur, and that means that the redemption story of Christianity is no longer necessary. Because the redemption story of Christianity really depends on the fall legend. Since there's no evidence for a literal Adam and Eve, since we have evolutionary theory, which is very, very heavily supported, since Genesis is probably false, at least the creation story therein, it seems to me that the soteriology of Christianity, that Christ came to save us from the fall, is false. And that then is a threat to Christianity. So even if that's true, one can still say that maybe Christianity has some worthwhile moral teachings. So for example, love your neighbors, you love yourself, do unto others as you do unto yourself. All of those sort of homilies that one finds in the New Testament are still, I think, reasonably good moral dicta. The only thing is they don't depend on God and they don't depend on soteriology. So I think evolution gets a huge bad reputation in the West because the West's primarily Christian, and therefore people appreciate that it threatens the Genesis story and hence the fall. So what we have on the screen now, which looks intimidating, is an excerpt from one of my journal articles where I'm demonstrating this argument. So I'm going to go through these technicalities very briefly so that you can understand just how strong this case is. So if we take step 1, the creation story of Genesis, CG, entails that there is original sin, OS. And step 2, original sin entails soteriology is necessary. And then I'm justifying that with reference to Romans 5:11. So therefore, from this we can conclude by deductive syllogism that the creation story in Genesis entails soteriology. If the theory of evolution is true or the creation story is true, in other words, that's a direct contradiction, it follows that either the theory of evolution is true or Genesis is false or vice versa. So TE then not creation. So if it's called the law of excluded middle, you have to choose one of those positions. You can't say the sky is blue and the sky is not blue. So then we go to a Bayesian argument that the probability of the theory of evolution, given the evidence, is greater than the probability of creationism, given the evidence. It follows that the probability of creationism is therefore low. So probability, it's probably not true, step 7, that creationism is true. Therefore, if probably not creationism, it follows that probably not original sin. In other words, probably there's no such thing as original sin. And therefore, if the probability of original sin is low, it follows that the probability of soteriology being true is low. From this, we can conclude that the probability of soteriology is low, or that the salvation doctrine of Christianity in particular is improbable. Now, if we accept that Christianity comprises soteriology plus specific moral teachings of Jesus plus theism, and we accept that probability of soteriology is low, we're still left with Jesus' moral teachings and we're still left with theism because, remember, theory of evolution doesn't in fact refute theism because deism could still be true. From this, we can conclude that in fact most of Christianity still survives TE. So theism survives and Jesus' moral teachings survive. What doesn't survive is the human sacrifice story, the soteriology. That doesn't survive. The next question one might ask is, does theory of evolution perhaps help religion? And what I want to argue is that in fact, yes, it does. So if you believe the theory of evolution, you can in fact solve one of the atheists' big problems for religion. So atheists like to argue that religion must be false because if God is good, God would not allow evil. So my answer is no, in fact, if evolution is true, you can't make that argument. So does evolution help religion? So the problem of evil is as follows. God is all good, all powerful, and evidently unwilling or unable to prevent evil. Now, there are many problems, responses to the problem of evil, and they all seem to fail, including the free will defense, because that in particular does not account for natural evils. So there's an author called Rowe who was writing in the early 1990s, and he gave a number of examples, one of which was E2, example 2. And E2 consists of a fawn or cute little Bambi deer that dies in a forest fire. Other examples might be hurricanes as tools of punishment, indiscriminate punishment, and so on, victim suffering. So these are examples of evils that are not catered for by free will. So you don't get a hurricane because of free will. You don't get indiscriminate punishment because of free will. You don't get victim suffering because of free will, and so on. So, for example, a cute little deer dying in a forest fire, he didn't choose to do evil and therefore deserve to be burned to death in a forest fire. So these are natural evils that come upon people and creatures as a result of things other than free will. And therefore, these are evils that cannot be explained by reference to the doctrine of free will. So the best escape from the problem of natural evil is to say that it helps creatures evolve. In other words, believers need the theory of evolution to answer the problem of evil. Evil is necessary in order for evolution to take place, because if something doesn't die, you can't evolve. So evil is a necessary evil, and it's part of God's plan, it could be argued. Thus, the theory of evolution actually helps some religious points of view to make the case that God is benevolent and has designed the world such as to improve creatures' lives and make life better. And there's the formal demonstration of the argument. So it is good that species evolve. God is omnibenevolent. Therefore, if God exists, then species will improve over time. Now, necessarily, the example E2 of a fawn dying entails that this would be an example of a species improvement occurring because the buck was too stupid to avoid a forest fire, or he was not sensitized to detecting forest fires. So he didn't get to go and breed because he was not able to see the warning signs of a fire. So that helped buck in that particular case to not be so stupid about fire and to learn to run away from it and so on. Therefore, if God exists, necessarily some evil like E2 would exist because species must evolve and become better. Sandy, would you mind going on mute? Thank you. From this, we can conclude that if God exists, necessarily God would allow evil E2 as part of the sort of general structure of life on Earth. So you would find that, for example, why do we feel pain when we touch a stove? Well, because you want creatures to avoid heat and touching stoves. So from that, we can see that a good God would allow suffering in that sense. And evolution necessarily involves suffering and death of creatures. So therefore, evolution can in fact support a theistic worldview. It definitely doesn't refute evolution, religion. Summary and conclusion. Evolution calls into question the origins of species and speciation only, not the origins of life, which is abiogenesis, nor the origins of the universe, which is cosmology. There still may be gaps for God to fill, such as abiogenesis and cosmology, and science needs to answer those questions. And until then, in my view, it's quite reasonable for theists to hold the position that God did it. I mean, I don't think they're right, but I can see the reasoning. Evolution does not, in fact, threaten deism, and all it does is refute scriptural infallibility, that is, that scriptures are perfect, and it does contradict Genesis and original sin, so probably the salvation doctrine of Christianity is false. But that does not entail the entire Bible is false. So, for example, the tales of the ancient Hebrew kings may be true. That would take archaeological research. The story of Jesus might be true apart from the magic shows, and so on. So one can't reject the whole of religion just because of evolution. Furthermore, as we've mentioned, evolution supports the evolution of creatures and therefore a benevolent deist position. So there was another religious writer, Liu Tzu, who was a Taoist figure writing about 2,500 years ago. He pronounced that higher creatures emerge from lower creatures. So did the ancient Greeks pronounce this. And the ancient Greeks were polytheists. So you've got a Taoist religious figure and ancient Greeks who were polytheists saying that evolution takes place. So again, an example of evolution not refuting religion. Therefore, it's both logically coherent to believe in God and evolution. And evolution is therefore a potential answer to the problem of natural evil, that is, necessary evils caused by nature. Hence, religion can in fact be helped by the theory of evolution. Most importantly, then, atheism does not follow from evolution. It follows from materialism, which is the view that everything is physical. So on the idea that evolution shows that religion is false, Professor Dawkins gets an F. And the real threat to theism then is whether there is anything such thing as a spiritual, which, as I mentioned earlier, for me, the evidence of fMRI is the biggest threat to religion, not evolution. Thank you. That's it.
Thank you, John, for that very interesting presentation and spot on time as well. we have time for questions. It's probably easiest, John, if you run the question time. What I'll do is I'll ask people if you will turn off your camera, so that if you do turn your camera on, then that means you want to put a question. You can also raise your hand in the participant list. John, can you see the participant list on your machine?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, so I will turn it back to you to run the question session, and if people turn on their videos, then it means they want to talk and they need to unmute themselves, please, just to save John having to find the unmute button. So over to John and over to the audience to ask any questions.
All
Thank
right,
you.
so if I can briefly intervene, I see Ziggy's got his screen up, but I see that Basil Johnson beat him to it on the text, so that looks like a protest. So Basil Johnson's question is, can we spend some explanation on the MRI evidence? So for me, if you look at my research papers, the majority of them deal with philosophy of mind. And there's a lot of fascinating evidence that comes out of MRI. Some of it pretty terrifying, which I can go into. And what's interesting about it is that there's strong correlations between brain activity and mental states. And the ancient Greeks actually were quite smart people. And one of the famous, I can't remember exactly who said it now, because I haven't looked at this material for about 2-3 years. The observation from the ancient Greeks was, why do you faint when you get hit on the head, but you only experience pain if you get hit on the foot? So clearly your consciousness resides in your skull. So if you want to, for example, talk about things like souls and spirits, you have to just say what you mean by that. And I find that when I interrogate believers about souls and spirits and such, they find it very hard to avoid equating the mind or consciousness with soul and spirit. Sometimes they try to avoid that. I have encountered people who try to avoid that conclusion, that they're the same thing. But most people, when pushed, have to admit that when they talk about the spirit, they mean the conscious mind. If that's the case, then it's very demonstrable with MRI that the consciousness is in fact just the brain activities. This is demonstrable by a few simple experiments. So the first would be chop off somebody's head and ask them to talk to you, and you'll notice that they stop talking fairly shortly. And you'll notice that their brain stops operating fairly shortly, and they no longer report having conscious experiences. So that would suggest that the consciousness resides again in the head. Same thing, knock somebody on the head, they fall unconscious. Give somebody an anesthetic, they fall unconscious, etc., etc. So it's fairly clear that the consciousness has something to do with the brain. So there's a whole research area in philosophy called philosophy of mind. It's related to psychology as a discipline, but it's most closely related to neuroscience and neuropsychology. And if you look at most of my papers on neuroscience and neuropsychology, I deal with these questions about specifically what is free will. How could it be instantiated by a neurological computer? Does it matter whether we have such a thing as free will? And just to give my position cards on the table, so my present view and my view for the past 20 years has been that Sam Harris and people like that and Dennett have a very good understanding of this. It's highly unlikely we have such a thing as free will. Now, Dennett himself has a position called compatibilism. Those of you who don't know Dennett, he's one of the four horsemen of the atheism. So he's a big atheist. He's what we call a compatibilist. So he believes that the mind is somehow caused by the brain or represents the activities of the brain. But he's prepared to accept the concept that there might be something called free will. And he plays around with words to do this. So he relies on things like phrases like free will is where you get what you want because you want it. And you could implement that under, say, a fully neurological, fully neurologically deterministic model. You could still, that would still be true. So he says, and therefore you have free will. So him and Sam Harris, for example, the other horsemen of the apocalypse, along with Dawkins, Harris disagrees, and I support Harris on this position. And Harris, his doctorate is in fact in neuroscience, so I'm more inclined to take Harris seriously. So one of my publications deals with what are called the Libet experiments. So in 1983, there was a guy called Benjamin Libet, and what he did was he tried to time consciousness versus brain activity. And he found that there was a significant timing gap between reported consciousness and brain activity. And more recent experiments, replications of Libet using fMRI, show that the timing gap can be as big as 10 seconds. In other words, your brain starts doing stuff 10 seconds before you as a person are aware that you've made a decision. And that suggests that your so-called decisions are in fact non-conscious brain events happening before you are aware of them, and therefore before you could potentially control them. So from a religious spiritual point of view, if you happen to believe that, say, the soul and the mind are spiritual, you're left with a huge number of problems, like how then is the soul in any way controlling the body? There's a very famous case of this problem coming up in Descartes in the 1600s, where he says, how does the mind control the body? He concludes it's through the pineal gland, an arbitrary little structure in the brain. But he's wrong, of course. And it doesn't answer the question. It's what we call kicking the can down the road. Because you need to ask, well, why is the pineal gland special? How does it turn soul powers into material movement of the body? It doesn't answer the problem. It's just kicking the can from the corpus callosum or the cerebellum into the pineal gland. It really doesn't help. So it's easier to just bite the bullet and say the brain is physical, the soul is activities of the brain, the soul is physical, and that is the end of the question. There's a very interesting problem that also comes up with theism as a result of this, which is why I say fMRI is such a huge problem for theism. Because take this case, if the soul is in fact just the activities of the brain, and the soul is what's controlling the body, and it's the mind and it's the activities of the brain, it suggests the soul's physical, fine. What about big souls like angels or gods? Okay, so this becomes even more problematic, right? Because if you're going to concede that the human soul is just brain activity, that means a whole bunch of things. Like, first of all, when you die, and those electricities stop moving, electrical signals stop moving around. So you are then dead, and your electricity dissipates. So that's one huge problem. The other huge problem is then, what is God made of? I mean, if he exists in space and time, what is he made of? So you'll see amongst my journal articles, one of the interesting ones I've put up is a defense of pantheism. So let me quickly disclaim and say I don't believe pantheism, but I've put a defense of pantheism up because for me that's the only plausible model of God. And what that does, and the way that works, is it uses a model of mind called functionalism, which says that as long as something functions like a brain, it can be a brain. So for example, AI, computers, if we could instantiate something very much like a brain with a computer, we would have a conscious mind. That's the idea of AI ultimately. So the idea with pantheism is that God is everywhere and everything. Now, if you look at the patterns of dark matter filaments through the universe, they look remarkably like a brain and the neural structure of a brain. And that is really interesting. And if that is true, if functionalism is true, it is very possible that the universe itself could have consciousness as a kind of a side phenomenon, or what Dennett calls an epiphenomenon of its mere existence. So for me, that's a fascinating idea. I think it's false for various reasons I give in the paper, but it's still an interesting idea, and it's far more plausible than "and then God said." So some theists argue that God is extratemporal, or supratemporal, or supramaterial, so he's not in the universe per se. But then that raises a different problem. It raises the Descartes problem again, but from outside the universe. So how does God impinge on the universe? How does he control your providence? How does he make you have good luck? How does he find your car keys for you, etc.? If he's not in the universe. So if God intervenes in space and time, it suggests that he must be part of space and time or able to interact with it. So you've got a cosmological pineal gland problem in that case. So you can see why fMRI is actually devastating to religion compared to evolution. Evolution is trivial to dismiss from a theistic position. Evolution only threatens soteriology. It doesn't threaten anything else. Whereas fMRI is drastically threatening because it really makes the spirit non-existent. It reduces the mind to electricity. Now, some very scary examples of fMRI. Let me scare you now. About 2 years ago, the Japanese succeeded in extracting images from the mind. Okay? So they would put an MRI on somebody. They'd get them to look at a series of stereotype pictures, post boxes, cats, etc. And they recorded the neural signals that corresponded to those pictures. They then would say to the person, the experimental subject, okay, what you're going to do is you're going to look at pictures and our computer will tell us what you're looking at. So we're in a different room and the computer will tell us what you're looking at. But the computer didn't just tell them what they were looking at. It actually showed a picture drawn from the algorithm, drawn from the neural signals, drawn from the speckles on the fMRI, what the person was looking at. And the pictures aren't great, but you can kind of see what they're looking at. So the researchers were able to tell in another room using MRI what the experimental subject was looking at. Now, why is that terrifying? So for example, let's say you're accused of a murder. Okay, it means all they need to do is put you into a machine, show you a few photographs of the murder scene, and then if your brain lights up with the pictures of the murder scene afterwards, they can say, well, you definitely recognize that murder scene, don't you? You must be guilty. So it really brings to light and possibility something like thought crime or pre-crime, like we see in Minority Report, where they know what you're going to do before you do it, or they can tell from just reading your mind. So recently we saw Elon Musk demonstrating Neuralink with some pigs. This is fully plausible. We've already had these experiments done. A few years ago, there was an experiment where they wired somebody's brain up to internet. And then on the other side of the Atlantic, they put a robotic arm, also wired up to internet. And the person was able to operate the robotic arm across the Atlantic using internet. So really, anyone who wants to dispute the physical nature of the mind, you're really wasting your time. The evidence is overwhelmingly against you. What isn't 100% clear is exactly how it works. How do we have this magical, what Dennett calls qualia, qualitative experiences? How do we have qualia? How does this electrical arrangement of our brain instantiate qualia? So that is one of the great mysteries that science hasn't answered yet. That plus the Big Bang, I would say, are the two big mysteries. And most people will throw God into that. I don't, but most people will. So that's the long answer to a very short question. See, John Richards says, will you come on my show? I'll just put my email address there and you can talk to me on email. Does anyone else want to ask a question? Any takers? Rick?
I thought Ziggy might, but he seems to be quiet. Yes, there's something I think you've glossed over, John.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
And that is that, as I understand it, the absolutely central premise of Christianity is the need for salvation by believing in Jesus Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what you have shown pretty conclusively is that because of the chain going back to Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden not existing,
Mm-hmm.
that entire chain falls flat. And therefore, I would say that Christianity isn't left with very much. Yes, you could look at the teachings of Jesus, but you're not left with anything about his divinity. you're not left for a need to believe in him. It would seem that the major pillar of Christianity is simply destroyed by evolution, and I don't think you're giving enough weight to that particular thing. You're almost weighting those three articles as equal weight and saying, well, there's a lot of Christianity left. I would disagree with you. Would you like to comment on that?
So I think that's a correct position if you look at modern Christians. If you look historically, say pre-Council of Nicaea, so before the whole discussion of Jesus' divinity, so let's assume, for example, that, so I've got a book on Amazon about this called Did Jesus Christ Exist? Where I express severe skepticism that the man even existed. If you look at Christianity prior to the Nicene Council, you see that a lot of the teachings and a lot of the belief systems were about sayings, which theologians refer to as your Q gospel, which is your kvela, your source of the homilies of Jesus. And if you take it seriously, that Q is the core of Christianity, then the whole soteriology thing and the whole divinity thing become curiously separated. Another interesting thing about the soteriology and human sacrifice aspect of Christianity is we find it in Gnostic texts. So I'm not sure how many of us have looked at, say, Gospel of Judas, which was one of the books that didn't make it in the selection process. And Judas' Gospel makes the Gnostic claim about the flesh being this inferior vessel that carries the spirit. And putting aside materialistic claims, to me it looks like Christianity is actually a hodgepodge of belief systems. And what we currently know as Christianity is really an overemphasis on the soteriology, which is actually a kind of a thing that came around the 300s. And a lot of the soteriology predecessors, such as the body being a vessel for the spirit, the necessity of Jesus to leave his body and become pure spirit, etc., which morphed into the human sacrifice idea. I find those conceptions of Christianity to be more ancient and specifically Gnostic rather than, say, Q gospel, which is mostly homilies. So it depends kind of on which Christianity. I mean, obviously, most of Christianity's history for the past 1700 years has been the type that you refer to. But we also hear people say things like, that's not a very Christian thing to do, or a real Christian wouldn't do such and such, which is really a reference to the homilies, do unto others, and so on. So for me, that's one possible answer to you. Another possible answer to you is if you look at parallel religions, so Judaism and the Islam, those religions primarily require submission to God, worship of God, absolute obedience to God. And neither of those depend on the Jesus divinity thing. So those religions are intact without the soteriology thing. And they have their own sort of pseudo-soteriologies where you'll go to heaven if you believe in God sufficiently strongly, if you worship God, if you follow his commandments, etc. So those are kind of act soteriologies where you save yourself through your devoutness. It's only Christianity that departs from that, and only in some verses, by the way, where it says that you're going to save yourself through grace, in other words, the sacrifice. There are some verses that talk about doing good works and so on, which are your more traditional Abrahamic positions. And you find this schism in Weber, for example, where he distinguishes between your North European Christianities and your South European Christianities, where your South Christianities tend to rely heavily on the soteriology, and your North Christianities tend to be more act soteriology, so they're more like you'll get into heaven through good works, etc. And the reason for these accommodations, of course, is the question of the salvation of Jews and other non-Christians, where there's an intuition in the north of Europe that it's unfair that a person should burn forever in hell because they didn't hear about Jesus, because they didn't believe in him, or they thought he was just a man, or he was just a prophet, or whatever. And there's this kind of sense of, well, maybe Jews will go to heaven if they work hard and do good deeds and so on. So you'll find some Christians will resist that insistence on soteriology for non-Christian people. So that's another possible answer. And then the third answer that occurs to me is, I think that if you look at most religions, there are just homilies and a belief in a God, or a superpower of some kind, whether you call it the Tao, or whether you call it Brahma, or whether you call it whatever. So when you look at Christianity and you strip out the soteriology, you're still left with a huge bunch of homilies. You're still left with believe in God. You're still left with Jesus was this wise preacher, which is kind of similar in features to Islam, minus the human sacrifice part. And the Muslims don't do the human sacrifice part. We wouldn't say they're devoid of religion. We wouldn't say they're devoid of a faith. So what I would suggest to Christians who wanted to accept evolution is just drop the soteriology and accept that your religion is not much different to Islam without it. And I realize that's a big ask, and you're right, it is a big ask. But I think if you look at this overemphasis of the soteriology story, there's still a huge amount of value that one could draw from this ancient culture without that silly human sacrifice part. I think Ziggy's waving his hand now, but I see Scott has also got his hand up for Bayesian equation. So Nogalides asked about academic reference. I'll paste that reference here. There we go. There's the academic reference. So Scott, you were first on the Bayesian question. Sorry, Matt and Ziggy. I'll cue you as 2 and 3. Scott, do you want to ask your question?
Okay, fine. I'm just struggling to unmute there. Okay.
No worries.
What I'm actually looking at is the use of sort of Bayesian mathematics to sort of try evaluate confidence in views. Do you not consider that ultimately the fundamental problem is that you comparing, say, the theory of evolution as understood by appropriately qualified people versus the biblical creationist account as espoused by mainstream churches. And this is in fact the wrong things to compare. And what we should be comparing is the theory of evolution against a concept of a consciously deliberate, dishonest, immoral God who's falsified all the evidence to look like evolution, when in fact the truth is quite different, to test your faith. And this actually was an issue put to me by a Roman Catholic priest, saying that this is a discussion point in the Vatican already in the 60s to deal with the problem of science and how at the time there was a massive surge of evidence from the Middle East refuting the Bible as a reliable account, and then of course raising questions. And the only thing that was holding them back from being open about it was the concern that if they acknowledged God as dishonest and immoral, people would leave the church and they wouldn't get the money. After our experiment with Donald Trump, then maybe that isn't really a problem. And so in fact, despite all that work you've done for a PhD, does it really, are we not finding that it doesn't matter what your outcome is? It doesn't actually deal with the fundamental debate around religion.
Sure. So let me just briefly answer that by saying that my PhD doesn't actually deal with these matters. So the theory of evolution doesn't make an appearance in my PhD. My PhD deals with cosmology, and it addresses the evidence for cosmology from a theistic perspective and from a scientific perspective. And it's in fact a response to a theologian called Richard Swinburne, who uses evidentialism to try and support theism, and I'm trying to show that he's in fact mistaken. And he makes a mathematical error, which is the punchline. He makes a mathematical error.
Okay.
Yeah, so this particular question, I think you're right, that would be one way to do it. There's also a question of subjectivism around Bayesianism, which you alluded to there, where we talk about what is the value of your prior probabilities, so your PA, your PE, and your pH by themselves. Those values are very subjective. One can try concretize them. One can try get decent, reasonable, mutually agreed values for those. And what you can also do is you can humor your enemy. So you could say to your opponent, what value would you put for this? And you could use their values. And in a lot of these cases, you can still show that they're mistaken because the values come out against them in the end. So let me give you a simple example. So let's say, for example, we wanted to give the evidence for theism as the Bible. The most objective way to do this would be to take every single verse in the Bible and say, is there historical proof of this verse? Is there historical proof of this verse? Is there historical proof of this verse? And then just do a strict count of number of verses with historical proof versus ones without. And say, well, objectively, you've got, say, 5% or 0.005 as your probability. And you could do the same for, say, theory of evolution, where we've got that big chart with all the supporting evidence. And we could say, well, here's 1,000 pieces of evidence that support evolution out of whatever arbitrary amount to be satisfied by. So if a theory has to have, say, 100 pieces of evidence in support, and you've got 1,000 pieces, then you can give it a very high probability. If you say, no, our threshold is 10,000 pieces of evidence, then we could go and find those 10,000 pieces of evidence. So there are ways to make these probabilities objective. Part of the difficulty is getting your opponent to agree.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm under a bit of time pressure. I've got to finish in the next 15 minutes. I think it was Ziggy and then it was Matt.
Thank you. John, it seems to me that this soteriology of Christianity depends rather heavily on the historicity or otherwise of the Jesus figure, and you did mention in passing that you've got views on that. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
So what interested me when I was doing my PhD is I discovered that there was this conspiracy theory online in the atheist communities that Jesus didn't exist. I first encountered the conspiracy through a book called Who is This King of Glory? It was written about 120 years ago by a British author who was looking at parallels between the Jesus story and the Egyptian mythology. And just superficially skimming through that book, I noticed that there were quite a lot of parallels that were alarmingly similar. And that triggered my awareness of the matter. And then I saw a conspiracy video called Zeitgeist. There are 3 Zeitgeist videos. The first one was the most wacky, with the most number of factually incorrect claims. And I looked at that video and I thought, no, this is definitely wrong. And I started writing up a rebuttal of it. And then I noticed that on further examination of some of the things I thought were wrong, that in fact they were correct on 1 or 2 points. One of them being that we have no direct archaeological evidence for the person of Jesus Christ at all. The oldest scripture manuscripts, I think, are 400s, if I remember right. The dating based on events described therein, they date them to 70 AD. So now if we think about, for example, how inaccurate our memory of, say, Elvis is, and that there are people that believe Elvis is still alive, and he only died, what, 50 years ago. You know, to think of a case where somebody died, say, 40 years prior, your accuracy of your memory is not going to be great. And those memories that are recorded there are for your Pauline epistles. And your Pauline stuff very seldom mentions Jesus in a physical form. A lot of it says, refers to him by name, but it doesn't refer to him or describe events in his life. Those are left to the Gospels. And the earliest dating I've seen for the oldest Gospel, which is Mark, I think is 90 AD. So you're looking at sort of 60 years after the putative life of Jesus Christ. So when you're looking at Mark, it's really like your grandmother, you're writing about your grandmother's life when you never actually met her. So the accuracy of Mark is disputed, never mind the ones after that, Luke, Matthew, and John. And then if you compare the Gospels in between them, they contradict each other quite heavily on a number of key points, like where did Jesus meet the disciples after crucifixion, after he rose, how many people were at his grave, were they angels or women, how many of each. There's disputes about where the miracles took place, how many people witnessed them. There's the order of the miracles and the homilies, what order did they occur in. There's a whole bunch of problems around it. So for example, if you look at the beginning of, I think it's Luke and Matthew, but I can't remember now, you've got the genealogies. You feel free to correct me on these things. My memory is very vague. I'm talking about a book I wrote about 10 years ago. The genealogies are significantly different. And in fact, what's worrying about the genealogies is that you've got Jesus putatively born of a virgin, not descended from David, but the genealogies all trace him back to David to make him the Messiah, because the Messiah in the Moshiach in Hebrew mythology has to come from David. But Jesus is given that genealogy in the books, but then he's said to be born of a virgin, meaning not from David. So there's all these problems that come up with the Jesus story. Never mind the missing childhood gospels, which we find in the Apocrypha, which are ridiculous books. If you read them, it has him doing stuff like smiting pigeons and smiting his friends and all kinds of mean stuff. So really, it's all very clearly mythological until you get to the books of the Gospels themselves, where his concrete life is described. But if you read the books of his concrete life in the Gospels, it's fairly unremarkable. It's a guy who's a teacher, he's walking around, he's saying stuff, and he gets crucified. Well, frankly, lots of people got crucified, hundreds, thousands, if not thousands. So what is remarkable about the story is absolutely nothing. This is just a zealot walking around, preaching his story from some document that predated him, which they call Q, citing the usual homilies that are present in the Talmud. They're present in the Torah in different forms. So even the do unto others is in I think Leviticus somewhere. So it's a fairly unremarkable story with very easy to believe details. And a very remarkable saying I saw once in a book by a guy called, what is his name now? I can't remember, local author. He said, just because a novel is realistic doesn't mean it's historical. So, I mean, if you read the Gospels, they come across as a realistic narrative of a guy walking around in the desert. But so what? I mean, Dan Brown's novels are realistic, but I'm pretty sure Professor, whatever his name is, doesn't really exist. You know, so something being a realistic story doesn't necessarily mean it's true. And then when you look at the Old Testament, where you've got these fantastic stories of great beasts swallowing people in the sea and they don't die in digestive juices, and manna falling from heaven, and Israelites surviving 40 years to get 20 kilometers from Egypt to Israel, you know, you get these preposterous stories, and you look at this and it's clearly nonsense. So when you're looking at the New Testament, which is really believable by comparison, it's a very unremarkable story of a guy walking around saying stuff and then gets nailed to some planks and he's dead. So for me, that's an unremarkable story. It's not the greatest story ever told by far. It's a fairly mundane story. And so from my argument in my book about Jesus' existence, as I say, this is a very believable story because it's so mundane. The only part that's not believable is all the magic tricks, plus the part that he was born of a virgin, plus the part that he's in fact God, because there's no reason to believe any of that. And there's technical reasons not to believe it as well. So there's a story that the word in Greek for maiden versus the word in Hebrew for maiden versus the word in Aramaic for maiden are ambiguous. They can mean a girl or a virgin. So this got mistranslated by King James, hence the myth that carried on. There's all kinds of funny anomalies like that. But in terms of archaeological evidence, raw archaeological evidence, there's zero. I'm exaggerating by saying zero because I can think of 2 cases that corroborate the story, but they don't corroborate Jesus. The examples in particular are the Pilate stone and the Caiaphas stone. So they found a tombstone with the name Caiaphas on it, or in ancient Hebrew, Caiapha, and they found a stone mentioning the name Pontius Pilate. That's it. 2 stones with 2 names carved on them. Now, the fact is that that suggests that those individuals existed. But so what? I mean, I can write a novel about JFK where there's a bunch of fictional characters in a novel. It doesn't mean JFK didn't exist, and vice versa. It doesn't mean the novel's true. Just because there's some historical figures in a novel, it doesn't make the whole story true. It just means that some of it's true. So maybe Caiaphas existed, maybe Pontius Pilate existed, but it's still not proof for JC. That's the problem. We don't have a carving of him. We don't have his own novel written in his own hand. We don't have his diaries. We don't have his sandals. We have found a grave which mentions names. This was by Simcha, what's his name now? I can't remember. Some Israeli archaeologist found a grave in Jerusalem where there are, what are they called? Grave boxes. What's the word for them? Something with an OS, something. I can't remember the word now. It's a little box that you put bones in. Once the person's died, dried out, you take all their bones. Ossuaries. Thank you, that's the word. Yeah, so they found all these ossuaries, and on the names of the boxes, it's got like James, Mark, Luke, Jesus, Joseph, etc. And that's all very well. But so what? I mean, those are very common names. The Bible's full of those names. It's like going to England and you're looking for proof of King Arthur, and you find a family tomb which has Arthur and Jennifer buried in it, dating back, 1,500 years. And you're like, oh, it's Arthur's tomb. It's his wife, Jennifer, and Arthur, king. I mean, so what? Arthur and Jennifer are common names. So, it's really speculating to suggest that this is JC, and there's a very big problem with it. Furthermore, if there's in fact a box with bones in it and it's got the name Jesus on it, or Yeshua, to give the Hebrew, didn't he go up into the sky? Wasn't he assumpted? Why are his bones in a box? Right? That clearly makes Christianity nonsense as well. So I mean, even if he did exist, you've still nonsensified the whole flying up into heaven thing. So there's huge problems with the archaeological evidence for this thing. I'm prepared to grant it on the assumption that there could be you could always check this thing based on DNA samples if you could get them, but really I don't think we're still going to get anything conclusive, much less a girl who can walk on water at the end of Da Vinci Code. So yeah, I'm skeptical. I'm prepared to grant credence that there was such a guy, but not that he was a magician. And if you grant that, then really you're just making Christianity the same level as Islam. It's just a religion with a prophet who said some stuff that is reasonable and some stuff that is a bit crazy. Digging your eye out is a bit crazy, for example. And that's it. I think that's good enough for religion. So we want Matt next, huh?
Thanks for the answer.
Sure. Matt, you're up.
Sorry, Zoom was messing me around. Honestly, Ziggy read my mind.
Okay.
Pretty much asked exactly the same question.
Okay, cool.
And I think your last bit sealed it for me, where you said, look, you're prepared to grant that he may have existed just without, all the mumbo jumbo. And I think I find myself in the same position. I'm not convinced either way. So thank you. It was a good answer.
Sure, pleasure. All right. everybody, I have to get going. I can take one last question if there's any, otherwise that's it.
Going once. Going twice. Right, we don't seem to have any takers. On behalf of SAS, I'd like to thank John very much for his presentation, very interesting. Thank you for stimulating our minds. And everybody who is on the leadership team, remember we have a SAS general meeting this time in a week's time.
All right, before we go, what I can do is I can chuck the PowerPoint into the chat so people can have a copy of it and go through it in their own time.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Right,
so
I'll keep it
don't mind
online
if
for a
you-
bit so people can download it if they want to.
Yep. Oh, it's quite big. It's 24 megs.
We'll see if it'll upload.
Yeah, it's going. It's about halfway now. So yeah, so I think when dealing with Christians, I think it's better to not nuke their whole religion in one shot. And that's why what interested me about this idea of this talk was to say to them, look, guys, you can carry on believing in God. You can carry on accepting Jesus' homilies. Just drop the slightly more wacky stuff. He self-sacrificed to himself to save himself from himself because he was angry with himself for allowing a lady to eat a snake's apple. If you drop that little weird part there. Okay, all right, everybody, thank you very much. Oh, academia, sorry, I see there's a question, academia edu, yeah. Let me send that link, academia edu.
Yes, I know. Maybe the good news on this academia, John, is that as soon as I loaded this thing up, academia has been sending me links to your articles.
Okay, all right, okay.
Yeah, so maybe it does work.
Yeah, it's the spyware. It's computer spying on these things you're doing. There's the link. All right, thanks very much, everyone. I have to go.
Thanks again, John.
Cheers, bye.
Bye, and
Bye-bye.
thanks everyone for attending. Bye all. We'll stay online so that you can do your download, and once everybody's left, then we'll know we're done. Yes, I can.